In this episode, Jen David Lang of The Main Idea and I talk with Will Parker about his new book, Messaging Matters: How School Leaders Can Inspire Teachers, Motivate Students, and Reach Communities, which Jen has summarized in The Main Idea. You can learn more about Will and his work at his website, williamdparker.com. Please enjoy this interview with Jen David Lang and Will Parker. Welcome, everybody, to this episode of the School Leadership Show. I have with me, I'm just going to say with me, as always, is Jen David Lang. Hi, Jen.
Hi, Mike. How you doing?
My mostly, often, all the time co-host. And with us, a very special guest, Will Parker. Will, thanks for joining us today.
Oh, what a pleasure to be with both of you.
And we're going to talk a little bit about, we're going to ask you to talk a little bit about your background and what you're up to now first. And then we're going to get into talking about your new book, Messaging Matters: How School Leaders Can Inspire Teachers, Motivate Students, and Reach Communities. So very excited about that. But first, for listeners who aren't active subscribers to your podcast, tell us a little bit about your background and kind of the things that you're working on right now.
Sure. Well, first of all, just thank you so much, Michael, for the work that you're doing for school leaders and for your leadership in podcasting. What a privilege it is for me to be on your show. And Jen David Lang, thank you for the wonderful work that you do. I so enjoy reading your summaries. And so I was so excited when you guys reached out to me to participate in today's conversation. My background, I was an 11-year classroom teacher and a 13-year school administrator in Oklahoma. Around the Tulsa area. I served in several schools here as a teacher. I started my career in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, where I was a teacher of the year there and way back in the 1990s. And then when I became an assistant principal in the Tulsa area in 2012, I was recognized as Oklahoma's assistant principal of the year. And that kind of launched me into creating content for school leaders. And so I started writing a blog. I started creating a podcast. And as I became a high school principal, I was putting together the content for this book, Messaging Matters. And so my background has been in education for 24 years now. And for the last 5 years, I've been creating content for school leaders. 2.5 years ago, I transitioned to become the executive director for Oklahoma's Association of Secondary School Principals and Middle Level Education Association. So I lead 2 state associations as an executive director. So my full-time work is providing resources, support, training, and advocacy for school leaders. So that's a little bit about me. And I can't remember the second question, Michael, but that's a little bit about my background.
Well, no, that's fascinating. I mean, we could just go right there. Let's just dive into all that. No, we're going to talk about the book. So, so in terms of the book, so why this book? You said you had started as you were getting into being a high school principal, thinking about the content for this book. So why this book? Why this book right now? Talk about what motivated you to do it.
Sure. Well, I came out with, as a principal, was called Principal Matters: The Motivation, Action, and Courage Needed for School Leaders. And that was a book that I wrote primarily for new leaders, because in my own work, I found that school leadership can often be so overwhelming that unless you surround yourself with other like-minded people and you change your attitude from becoming the Superman to understanding the power of teamwork and collaboration, you'll never survive. And so as I was sharing content on that book, I began to realize, too, that part of the shift that I had made as a school leader was as I was moving from this idea that you've got to figure it all out yourself to this shift to I need other people to help me carry this load and to share and to create a school community. That celebration and messaging was such an important part of the role that I played as a leader. Effective communication was something that I became really committed to. And part of that came from some of the research that I was doing. I had read Rick DeFore's book, In Praise of the American Educator. And Rick talked a lot in that book about some of the research that Gallup had done with schools to see what did communities actually think about their schools. And what they discovered was that the average parent, when you surveyed them about schools in general, what do you think about public schools in your in America? Most of them would assign D's or F's to their perception of how schools were performing. But if you were to ask them specifically about their community schools, more parents were apt to say that they would give those schools A's and B's. And so there was this weird dichotomy in school leadership, which is that people perceive our schools are failing unless they know the stories of our schools. And so the people in your local communities are often more apt to understand the power. So when Gallup was surveying parents about schools in general, most of them would say that they would give D's and F's to public schools in general. But when you surveyed parents about their local schools, they were giving them higher grades, A's and B's. And so the takeaway from that is that when school leaders take the time to tell their local communities what's happening in their schools, they're more supportive. They believe in the work that your schools are doing. And for me, the challenge was, how do I tell my story to my community, but not just to my community, but the surrounding communities? Because I'm a huge advocate of the work that we do in schools every single day. And especially for public school folk, perception drives policy. And the kinds of policies that we have coming from our state legislatures or from our federal government or even from our school boards are often driven by the perceptions that they have of our schools. And one of the biggest challenges I see for school leaders is that we spend so much time putting out fires, managing crisis, dealing with difficulties, that often that's the bulk of our day. But what we're reflecting back to our community can't be that. We can't just be letting them know all the crises we've managed or the difficulties that we've dealt with or the problems that we've solved. We have to be reflecting back to them what's working in our schools. Yeah, so for me, the big challenge was, as a school leader, how do I manage the difficulties of my school, take care of the crisis in my school, and solve problems in my school, which is the role of a leader, but at the same time, reflect back to my community the things that are working, the celebrations, the productivity, the outcomes that are happening. Because for school leaders, how we communicate about our schools is often what people will invest in and support for their communities. And so I'll tell you a quick story. When my father was much younger and I was a little boy, I grew up in West Tennessee out in the middle of nowhere. I was a rural kid, grew up on a farm, and my dad liked to look at the night sky through a telescope. And so often we would look at the moon. And one of the things I learned as a child was that when you look at the moon, no matter how great your telescope is or where you are on the planet, you can only see one side of it, no matter where you are, because of the way that the moon orbits around the Earth. And so only until you can get in that satellite or spaceship and go around to the other side, you can't see the other side of the moon. And a leader once told me, Will, leadership is a lot like seeing all of the moon. You get to see more parts of it than anyone else. But unfortunately, other people can't see all the moon that you see unless you're willing to communicate it to them. Now, as leaders, that means that sometimes we can't show them the whole moon because of confidentiality, because we have to protect FERPA and privacy rights. But then we also have a responsibility to show them what we can. And so we need to be managing the difficult parts of our schools, but we also have to be able to showcase and highlight and celebrate the amazing things that are happening in our schools, or people don't know they're happening. And so when I wrote this book, I tried to think about how can you showcase those things to your students, how can you showcase them to your teachers, and then how can you showcase them to your communities so that everyone has a full orbed perspective of what's happening in your schools.
So that is
I really like the way that Will, in the book, you even add further to that, where you say it's not just about, as a school leader, managing the difficult conversations and aspects, but also highlighting the positive messages and sending those out. But you say that by focusing on the positive, it actually helps to proactively diminish some of the negative and get ahead of it. It's almost like with trust. The more that you add to the trust bank, then it's not as difficult when you need to withdraw from it.
Yeah. Thank you, Jen, for saying that. Because, Michael and Jen, when I first committed to stronger communication with my school, and I'll give you an example. One of those was putting together a weekly newsletter, just celebrating the great things happening with my kids and teachers. So every week, my parents knew to expect this communication from me. There was an immediate shift and the kinds of conversations that I had at school events. So when I would go to school events in the past, I would see a parent come over to talk to me, and often they would have a concern or something that they wanted to share with me. And that's part of my job, is to deal with concerns. But I saw a shift happening when I was sending out weekly communications of celebration, because a lot of parents were coming up to me to talk to me first about that. They'd seen their kid in a picture. They were excited that we were celebrating the band. They were excited to see their child being highlighted in Future Farmers of America, whatever the area was. And so the parents already had a relationship with me because I was developing it with them by communicating with them the positives happening with their kids. And so that built an additional measure of trust, so that when I did have to manage a difficulty or bring a kid into my office or contact a parent about some challenge happening, already hearing consistently about the good things. And so they had a deeper trust with me to manage the hard things.
I always found that to be the case too, both as a teacher and as an administrator. You never want the first communication you have, particularly with a family, to be negative. And unfortunately for a lot of folks, it often is. So you had a good segue in there in talking about, the different constituencies really that a school leader is responsible for communicating with. So let's go after the teachers here. So how do you mentioned a couple of ideas, but you want to get into some specifics about how you have experienced success communicating with faculty and staff?
Yeah. I would say the first and most important thing is that you establish a community of collaboration and communication with your teachers. And so I often use the analogy of, and I'm a story guy, of rowing. One time I was on a trip with another school leader, and we rented a kayak for a quick jaunt into a river. We were heading to a destination, and as we were rowing along, I was in the front, he was in the back, and we finally just stopped and looked at each other and said, we're not getting very far, because I was rowing one direction, he was rowing another, and we began to move our oars at the same time in the same direction so that we could navigate across. And I think sometimes as school leaders with our teachers, we may be rowing one way, they may be rowing another, because we're not actually engaging them in the problem solving in collaboration that it takes to run a school. And so I would often, in the work that I do with teachers, include them in my decision making. I embedded times with them into my schedule so that I'm consistently meeting with teachers. I'm consistently asking for their feedback. I'll give you an example. Before a faculty meeting, I would never put an agenda together after I learned how to collaborate without first pulling in a team of teacher leaders and asking them, what should we be addressing in our next meeting? And can you look at the things that I placed on an agenda and help me edit this so that it's meaningful, and so that the time that we have together is meaningful, so that the input comes from them, not just from me, on what we need to be talking about. And so part of that is building a community of collaboration. I think another important thing to do for teachers too is to develop an understanding of what everyone's key responsibilities are. And I talk to leaders about this a lot. People will react. People do not need to guess what their responsibilities are. And so often in schools, we create a lot of confusion because new teachers, for instance, or even older teachers, may not know who's responsible for what within a school. And one of the shifts that I made when I went from assistant principal to high school principals, I began to meet with all of my non-instructional staff and just survey them. What are the things that you do for your job every single day that maybe I don't understand? So maybe that was, in my case, a school registrar or the school counselor or a school's paraprofessional, or maybe my school secretaries. And we began to develop key responsibility lists for each of their job description areas so that I had a better understanding of their work. But then we would share those with new teachers and our existing staff so they could see who in the building is responsible for which areas. So when you've got a problem, you know who to go to. And then there's several more I could talk about, Michael, but I think it's important to just provide helpful touch points for feedback. And so for me, that meant that I'm going to be meeting with teachers regularly, that I'm going to be sitting in their collaboration groups if we have PLCs in my school. And of course, we could talk about students too, but engaging students in those same conversations so that everyone is a part of the decision making that's happening in the school.
Can I add one thing I really appreciate about the way you talk about messaging in the book is that most of us think of messaging as what does the leader say, or what is the written communication that the school leader sends out. But you expand the definition of messaging to so many things, like the examples you just gave, right? Of collaboratively crafting the roles and responsibilities of different staff members, or putting together an agenda with your with the faculty members. So these are examples of things that I think many leaders don't necessarily think of when they think of messaging, but you really make the point that it's every action that a leader makes, not just everything that a leader says, that communicates what your values are, what's important, and all of your actions, all of your decisions are about messaging.
Well, that, and I think too, something that kind of a theme or a thread that runs through this is the idea of listening. And I mean, a lot of people are good at soliciting feedback, but do they really listen? And I think to your point, Will, about asking veteran folks in varied roles about their jobs, and then even taking it to the step of saying, well, you've worked for a lot of different principals. What are some things that other principals have done that have helped your work? What are some things that have gotten in the way? You know, what do you really need me to not do to mess so that I don't mess up your ability to do your job? And I think, and you know, it's kind of a convoluted way to look at it, but people appreciate that you're going to try to not get in their way.
I agree. And I think it's also important to empower the other people within your teams to become good messengers too. So for instance, when I was able to train an assistant principal as a high school principal, and she saw the kind of messaging that I was doing through my weekly summaries for our community, she asked me, well, I think we need to have a stronger weekly communication summary for our teachers. Like, here's a summary of the instructional objectives you have this week. Here's a glimpse at next week's calendar. And she called those Friday wrap-ups. And she owned that. And so she came up with the idea. She began to put together a weekly summary that was just targeted for teachers. But that wasn't something I had to create. It was something sometimes I would help curate because she would bring it to me for feedback. But by modeling first what that communication looks like, and then leaning on other people who may have strengths that you don't, then you've got other people on your teams too who can become powerful messengers for your school too.
And that's helpful for school leaders who may not be the natural writer, speaker that you are, Will, and who may be looking at this as a daunting task to, become a communicator in chief, to prioritize messaging. So I think thinking about it that way as a team, your assistant principals, your leadership teams, even, a tech assistant or someone who can help you spread the message that it's not up to you alone as the leader.
Well, and I think, in terms of that whole good to great idea, right? That it was in that book. Was that the getting the right people on the bus thing?
Yes.
Right. So that's the whole thing. If you're a leader who's not a great writer, find somebody who is, and then take something off of their plate and let them do that piece of it. I mean, I think we spend so much time in education trying to get good at things that other people are already good at that we don't necessarily need to be good at. Take a strengths-based approach to this and let the people who can do it. Yeah,
I love that, Michael. And an example of that from my past work was I'm a dreamer, I'm an innovator, I'm a creator. We had a team of teachers and some of my admin assistants and a counselor who wanted to put together a new remediation schedule for the coming year. This was when I was still in the principalship. And so I pulled together this group of people that were active in wanting to develop some schedules and ideas. And I asked them, let's put together some models and let's beta test some of these, a semester before we want to actually try it. But I would like you guys to, here's my dream and here's what I see you guys saying. But I knew my strength was dreaming and asking for input, but I knew other people on the team had a better strength than actually building schedules and then implementing the documents that we were going to use to track student participation. And so I actually said in the subsequent meeting, I'm going to step out now because the longer I stay here, the less work you're going to get done, because I know my strength is dream, but I know your strength is action. And if I stay in the room, I'm going to keep you from actually getting the work done. And it was so true, but I knew where their strengths were, and I knew where my strengths are. And so, so if you're listening to this conversation and you realize, well, maybe I'm not a great writer because I love to blog, or maybe I'm not going to do a podcast. Well, you shouldn't. Or maybe that's an area that you want to grow in. But there may be people on your team who already have a passion for that area. Find out who they are and then utilize them.
So now let's transition to talking about students. So, you identify those three big buckets of folks to communicate with: teachers, students, and parents. So what were some of the successes you had in communicating with students? And to Jen's point earlier, how did you manage it practically? Because I think that's the thing. I don't think anybody listening would dispute the fact that it's important to communicate with teachers, students, and families and communities. But I think when it gets down to how do you actually do it? And how do you fit it into a day that's already, chock-a-block with everything that you have to do as a principal? How do you make time for that other stuff? Not other stuff, but the communication piece.
Sure. Well, there's lots of ways. So I'll try to touch on a few. First of all, I think you have to decide what's intentional, and because if you don't put things on your calendar, they often won't happen. And so one of the things that I tried to do that was intentional in an average week was to schedule a time that I knew I could be with a group of student leaders. And in our school, we had identified some students who we were actually able to create an elective leadership class where students could enroll in this course because they wanted to be involved in decision making. They wanted to be involved in hosting student activities and events for our school. And so I tried to be in with that group at least once a week, where I would stop into that class, get feedback from them, offer feedback to them, just like I did with teachers, so that I'm hearing from students directly. What are the things that are important to you? What are things happening around campus that I need to be aware of? And what are some things that I can assist you with, or you can be assisting me with as we move forward? Now, some weeks those were shorter meetings than others. Some weeks I could stay longer, and some weeks they didn't happen. But if they weren't already scheduled in as an intentional part of my practice, they wouldn't have happened. That's one example. Another example is just how do you approach your school year? So for me, as a high school principal, I knew that the most vulnerable population I had were my incoming freshmen. And so before my freshmen ever came to me, I always set up a meeting the year before. So as those eighth graders are transitioning the spring semester before the new school year, I would invite them to the school, and we would host a welcoming event for them so that they could hear from student leaders. They could hear from other teachers that ran activities that they might be interested in. I could cast a vision for them, and we could cast a vision for them of what high school should be like if they want to be successful. And then we did the same thing before school began with freshmen and their parents to come in for those same events. We hosted parent nights for juniors so that the year before their senior year, we could have really detailed conversations with incoming senior parents and their students of what's this last year going to look like, and how can you be preparing for college or career readiness. And so building events and scheduling times with kids for those important conversations are important. Those are intentional. And then the things that you can do on a daily basis, which are just those mindful practices, which means that when I'm walking through the building and I'm on my way somewhere, or maybe I'm doing some observations, or maybe I'm simply just trying to get from point A to point B, I'm being mindful of who's actually in front of me so that I'm making eye contact with kids, that I'm giving an attaboy to somebody who may have played a game the night before, that I'm just being present and noticing the beautiful, creative things that kids do, the silly things that they do. Maybe I'm doing some correction because that's my job too, to be a disciplinarian. But I'm being present and mindful as I'm walking through my school so that kids don't just see me as a suit, but they see me as a person. And so those are just some quick takeaways, Michael, in ways I think that principals can be cultivating the kinds of messaging that they're doing with their students.
I think to the point of how do you have time for this, the example that Will just gave of, walking through the hallways and being mindful, I think from his book, he's suggesting that we take some of the things that we regularly do and just change them a little bit. So if when disciplining a student, you usually use a harsh tone, to change your tone and realize that even when a student has made a bad choice, that you're still messaging something positive. So that's not adding more to your plate. It's changing what's already on your plate. If when you walk through the hallways, you used to sort of grumble a hello to teachers, and instead you say, hi, how can you help? How can I help you? And you're sending that message that we're all here to support each other, like Will says. It's not any extra time. It's just changing your approach. And the other thing that I think Will talks about in every single section, whether it's messaging with students, parents, or teachers, is consistency. Really communicating your message consistently, so that lends itself to habits. So, Will, you said that you made it a commitment to blog, was it once a week, every week for 5 years, and that you would always send that out on Wednesday. So you gave yourself a self-imposed deadline and you developed that habit. So I think some of the suggestions you have in the book, leaders can develop as habits, and then it's easier to fit them in.
Thanks, Jen. You're helping me remember even more things than I remembered. So that's powerful.
Where do you see the summary?
Jen's attention to detail is legendary. That's why we complement each other so well, because not so much for me. So let's talk about the community then. So talked about teachers, talked about parents. What has been your general approach and maybe some specific strategies for engaging with the community in terms of messaging?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. It's hard to separate them all because to me they're all the same. But when you're thinking about your community, you have to think about what we talked about at the very beginning. How is the experience of my school being translated beyond me or beyond the individual teacher's experience or beyond the individual student's experience? Because I have the responsibility of seeing more of my school than anyone else because I have the freedom to navigate it. But then I also have the privilege of sharing that out with other people. So I'll just give you a quick practical example. As I'm walking through a building and I'm seeing teachers and I'm seeing students engaged in learning, and I'm mindful of what I'm seeing too. Obviously, there's going to be things that I might need to address if I'm seeing things that are out of the ordinary or procedures that aren't being followed. But what I'm focusing on as I'm walking through is those things that I want to capture that make me excited that my own children are in my school, or make me excited that someone else's child is in my school. And so I put together, as almost every single time I would do a walkthrough, I would try to put together just a short reflection that I call kudos, where I jot down the things that I just saw as I did a walkthrough through my school. Maybe it was the language arts teacher students who were up acting parts of Shakespeare, or maybe it was the Algebra 1 student who was at the board actually doing the equation for the other students, or maybe it was the ag mechanics class where they're actually tearing a small engine apart, or whatever the course is that I'm viewing, or chemistry lab, whatever it is. And I want to put those things that I just said into a short little summary of kudos. These are the things I just saw as I walked through the school today. And there's several ways you can share that. You can capture it on a video on your phone. You can take some photos. You see kids do that. You can write a summary of it that you can share out. Often I would go back to my office or get on my phone and just send out a kudos email. Teachers, this is what I saw today when I was walking through the school. But I duplicate that content. I'm going to take that same information and I'm going to put that as a part of my newsletter that I share out with parents in the community. I'm going to create social media blurbs that also highlight some of those same things from the photos that I've taken, or maybe some small videos that I've captured. I had a media center specialist who, when we talked earlier about having people on your team, I had a media center specialist who would put together a Hootsuite for us. And if you're not familiar with Hootsuite, it is a website that you can use that helps you schedule social media posts in multiple platforms at once. And so Hootsuite allows you to upload to Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, all at the same time. And so I would send a post to my media center specialist on something I wanted shared out, and she could schedule it to go out on all of those platforms at the same time. And so it's almost like thinking about your school, not just as a school community, but your community as clients or customers. And I know that sounds so weird for school people to say that, but your school is a brand, and your communities should be proud of it. And so how are you celebrating out those wonderful things that are happening throughout your school's community so that the community itself is so proud that their kids are there each day? And it's not, you're not just sharing things out to create an impression of outcomes, but you are celebrating actual outcomes, the good things that are happening, because you're building momentum through that positivity.
But Will, how do you respond to the school leader who says, I understand positive messaging to students, I understand positive messaging to parents, I understand positive messaging to teachers, but why the community beyond? Why take the time to go on Twitter, Facebook, other social media platform to reach out to the larger community beyond the immediate school community?
Well, I'll tell you one of the reasons that it was important for us, and I don't know what it's like in New York for you guys or other states, but I think this is a common obstacle that I've talked to principals all over the nation about is teacher shortage or the difficulty of recruiting high quality educators into your buildings. And so in Oklahoma, we went through a long time with after the recession of budget cuts and restrained resources for schools. And so the pool of talented, high quality teachers was getting shallower and shallower. And so I saw it as my responsibility to make sure that the brand of my school, that the image of my school was not just within my community, but beyond my community, so that when I had an opening, I had a position to fill, I was already present in another space so that I could reach out and recruit or advertise positions, because I want the best teacher reaching way beyond my community whenever there was an opening, because they were already aware of what was going on at my school because of the sharing that we were doing beyond our community. I don't know if that's helpful, but that's one example.
Yeah, no, that's great, because I think a lot of principals feel they're just too busy to get on those platforms that reach beyond the immediate school community. So it helps to hear some of your context and the benefits that it brought.
And you mentioned that Hootsuite tool and the idea of identifying somebody who could kind of grease the wheels and support that process. Anything else specifically related to social media, or I know you mentioned email as people tend to scoff at email, but it really is an effective way to get to parents, especially speaking as a parent of 2 children in high school. Like that's what gets to me. I'm not checking social media all the time, but if an email comes from school, I pay attention.
Yeah, well, there's a couple that I know principals use. I've got some friends who use S'mores just as a way to create a really beautiful newsletter style that is something that they can post as a web address that they can share out too. But something that I did that I'm not aware of a lot of principals doing this because it's a business tool, but I created a MailChimp account that my parents and community members could subscribe to. So I had their email addresses through our student information system, but I would to subscribe to, and you can do this through Constant Contact or MailChimp, and your district may or may not allow you to do this, but mine did. But I created a MailChimp account for my parents and community members so they could subscribe to my weekly updates for a number of reasons. One, so I could see how many people were actually interested in receiving the news beyond just our normal stuff that came out through our messenger systems. And 2, because I could actually look at the stats. And so in my community, I had a high school of about 750 9th through 12th graders. So it was a moderately sized community outside of a suburb of Tulsa. And in our community, I had over 800 parents and community members subscribed to receive my weekly updates. And some of them were former parents or grandparents or aunts or uncles, people that weren't even in my student information system. But when I would send those out, I could look at the statistics and see who actually was reading my emails. So I might send out 800 emails through MailChimp, but it may only be 40 or 50% of my parents or community members who are opening it that week. And so what that showed me was what most, school leaders, I complained for years, and I hear school leaders complain all the time that I communicate, but nobody's listening. Well, it's true. It's also possible they just never open your email. And so what it showed me was that even though I think that I'm reaching my parents through my emails, some of them I'm not. So they need other ways to be reached too. So that's why I was so committed to duplicating my content through my email, through the MailChimp subscription, through my social media, through the Facebook. And it looks like overkill, but actually what it does is it's trying to reach people where they are, because I want my parents, whether they want that through a text message or a remind, or they want it through Twitter, that I've at least taken the time to try to create as many avenues as possible for them to get the message.
And I think that's a really big point is, meeting people where they are, not trying to shoehorn them into communicating the way you would prefer to communicate.
I was going to say one other point to Jen's question about why reaching out beyond your community. And it goes back to something that I said earlier. The impressions that people have about our schools collectively will often drive the public policies that affect us in the end. And sometimes we don't like the laws or the policies that are created by legislators. But if they don't see our schools as successful collectively, mine and yours and all over the nation, then we have a lot of bad public policy that often is written to try to correct the impressions. So if great schools aren't celebrating the things that are happening, then the impressions that they get are the negatives that they see in the media. And so I have this passion and belief that if more and more school leaders would own the messaging of their schools, the positive things that are happening, if we do that collectively, if millions of us are doing that all the time, then there's this overwhelming sense of positivity that's coming from the schools that work. And then we have models of places that are actually getting the job done that schools that are struggling can turn to for help and for inspiration. So that's another reason why I think messaging is so important.
So, Will, I want to be sensitive to your time and certainly to your time also, Jen. The book is Messaging Matters, How School Leaders Can Inspire Teachers, Motivate Students, and Reach Communities. Will Parker, where else can people go to learn more about you and your work?
Yeah, you can find all my resources at my website, and it's my name, WilliamDParker.com. And you can find me there if you want to look for me on Twitter. It's William DP, and I'm also on Instagram and LinkedIn and all those places too. But my resources can be found on my website, and I post weekly a free podcast and blog so that school leaders can find inspiration and ideas there as well. And Michael, I know you have amazing content too, so I'm just so grateful that I got to participate in your show today. And thank you, Jen, for your wonderful study and curating of content that you do too.
Thank you, Will.
Any parting shots, Jen?
Well, I'm writing a summary of the book, and it's great. Lots of great ideas, tech ideas, other ideas. So take a look at the summary.
Sounds good. Both of you, thank you so much for this time. What a great conversation about something that I really think we just expect that people know how to do, and but with a little bit of teaching and learning, people can get much better at it. So thank you both.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you, Michael.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the School Leadership Show, a podcast for aspiring and practicing school leaders. Send your comments, questions, and show ideas to me, Mike, at schoolleadershipshow.com. And please consider rating the podcast in iTunes and leaving a comment. And definitely pass the show along to your colleagues.